ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
Rangan Chatterjee grew up watching his doctor father come home in the evening after a day at the hospital, eat dinner, shave, and then head straight out to see more patients. 12 hours later, his dad would arrive back home. This time, he'd eat breakfast, shave again, and then go right back to the hospital for another day's work. It was a pattern Rangan's dad didn't break for 30 years, sleeping only 3 nights a week, until his body simply couldn't take it anymore. And it was a pattern that Rangan nearly fell into himself. Like his dad, Rangan went to medical school. He graduated with flying colours and an extra degree in immunology. He started his medical career at the same time as caring for his sick father and beginning to raise his own family. But when Rangan's father died, he found himself taking stock of the way that he was living and asking what the future would look like if he kept going the same way. Rangan came to see for himself and for his patients that health is deeply tied to happiness, and that when you're frantically climbing the ladder to success, you might end up missing your actual life. This is a message that he's been sharing, first as a medical specialist on the BBC and now as a podcast host and best-selling author. Rangan is currently on tour in Australia. Hi, Rangan.
Hey, Sarah. Lovely to be here.
Tell me about the memories that you have of your dad from when you were a kid. I mean, how much time did you spend with him?
I'm 47 years old now. I've got 2 children myself. And I now really reflect back on Dad's life, and I see it through a different lens. Like, I cannot understand how my dad managed to work that hard, how he managed for so long to only sleep 3 nights a week. I just can't imagine how exhausted and stressed out he must have felt all of the time. I mean, you asked me how much time did I spend with him. It's kind of interesting. I sort of remember Dad being around. I guess I didn't really ask myself the question, how much time is my dad spending with me? It was my norm. And, you know, you never realize that those are your norms until you actually realize that other people live in different ways, and other people may see their parents more or perhaps less because you're so influenced by your own experience. And I guess for me, it's, you know, when you get married, you know, I've been married for 18 years and you have this partnership with another human being and you meet their family and get to know their family. You realize, oh, wow, everyone kind of grows up differently. Everyone has a different experience of the world. I know it's so obvious, Sarah, as I say this now.
But it's not. Once you meet someone else, you think, oh, you've got a different kind of crazy to my crazy.
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, my dad came in 1962 to the UK from India. So Dad grew up in India. He qualified to be a medical doctor in India. And he left his friends, his family, his culture, everything that he knew in search of a better life for him, you know, his immediate family, you know, his wife, my mum, me and my brother, but also his family back home.
What do you think your dad's idea of success was back then? It doesn't sound really like he was being motivated by the new car or a bigger house, but more obligations to his family and including family back home in India. Is that what was driving all of those long hours of work?
My dad's not here. Right? Dad died in March 2013. And yes, it was probably one of the biggest and most impactful things that ever happened to me. But I do think that if my dad was alive, the one question I'd love to ask him was this. Was it worth it, Dad? Okay, was it worth it? My dad's obligation was duty. He felt that his role was to provide for his family and his parents back home in India, and to provide me and my brother with the very best education that he could. And so if that was my dad's goal and his sole goal in life, which I now believe was probably the case, then I can't say that what he did was a mistake. Yeah, he got sick. Yes, he got lupus. He was on a dialysis machine for 15 years. And yes, that had a huge impact on my mum. Me and my brother, we spent a huge part of our adult lives caring for Dad. So it's easy to say he made a mistake. And yes, do I believe he could have done that and not worked quite so hard? Yeah, I do believe that. At the same time, I don't think I can say, or I don't think it's fair for me to say that that was a mistake. It's his life. I'm not sure anymore whether I'd be doing what I'm doing today if my dad was alive. Clearly, the death of a parent is a very significant experience in most people's lives. And when I share this, I'm not saying anyone else should look at their parent's death in this way at all, right? I'm not saying that. I'm saying for me, 12 years on now since my dad died, I now see dad's death as a gift, right? I see it as a gift that my father gave to me. Now, why do I say that? Because it was only when my father died and I had this big hole in my life for months and years afterwards that I started asking myself some really important questions. You know, Rangan, whose life are you leading? Is this your life or is this someone else's life? And actually, the lessons I've learned through my dad's death, the career choices I've made, the way my career has ended up, the things I've learned about what it means to be a provider and to look after your family, those are things that I really reflected on and learned through my dad's death. So now I choose to look at my dad's death as a gift. I think maybe that's a gift that my father left for me.
Your dad and mum both immigrated from India. Where did they make their home in the UK? Whereabouts?
They made their home in Cheshire in the northwest of England. So, you know, about 10 miles south of Manchester. That was a big city nearby. And that's where I was born. You know, I still live there now, you know, interestingly enough. Not at home. You know, my mum lives 5 minutes away from me. But I still live in the same region and neighborhood where I grew up, which is actually not that common anymore, is it?
And so why do you think that is? What did you like about that part of the world growing up as a kid?
I think, first of all, it is a really beautiful part of the world. Okay, so, you know, if it wasn't a aspirational area to live in, perhaps I would have moved, right? But it isn't. It happens to be a really nice area. A lot of people would like to live in the sort of towns in Cheshire, which feed Manchester, right? So I have to acknowledge that, firstly. Secondly, I am a family guy, right? How my wife and I bring up our children is probably the most important thing to us. My mother is quite elderly now. She needs a lot of help. I live 5 minutes away. I probably see her, you know, on most days, or certainly 5-6 days a week. I'll at least pop in to see how mum's doing. And I've realized as I get older that that's actually important to me.
Did you spend much time in India as a family when you were growing up?
Every other summer, we would all go for 6 weeks to Calcutta in India. My dad would come out for 3 weeks and he'd come home to work. And me and my older brother and my mum would stay there. And I have such happy memories of those 6 weeks because we didn't have any family in the UK. And so I would only see my grandparents and my cousins once every 2 years. We'd go there for the summer. And I guess, again, it's easy with hindsight to talk about that and look at that. I didn't realize it at the time how formative it was for me. I just remember, we're going to India this summer and I see my cousins and we hang out. But there's such a different way of life in India. Even simple things. I remember maybe being like 8 or 9 years old and, you know, staying in this block of flats in the center of Calcutta where my mum's parents used to live and her brother and her sisters. And I remember at 4 p.m., you know, my cousins would be like, should we go and play football now? I'm like, yeah, sure. We go downstairs on the kind of, I don't know, the hard floor at the bottom of the apartments, but they play football barefoot. No one's wearing shoes. And so I'm like, oh, okay. And, you know, it was a little sore at first because I wasn't used to it. But then, you know, you spend an hour and a half just playing barefoot. And, you know, it's funny, like these days, I talk a lot about the benefits of being barefoot more or potentially wearing barefoot shoes and how good that can be for our gait, for the way that we move, our backs, our knees. And I think back and go, oh, wow. Well, maybe those summers where you would actually spend a lot of your time barefoot and playing football and tackling barefoot, maybe that was formative in your brain in a way that you didn't quite realize at the time.
Did life feel freer for you personally, even as a kid, Rangan, in India than it did in the UK?
I guess what I noticed is that my parents probably seemed happier. I guess I saw a side to my parents that I possibly didn't see that much in the UK. They were, my dad, I can still remember Dad, like, just sitting around the dinner table with his brothers and his mum. He was just, laughing and telling jokes and things that I probably didn't see in the UK because Dad was in the UK to work. And so maybe when he was in India and couldn't work for 3 weeks, another part of him came out. So I don't think I was conscious of it at the time. But yeah, I think I would have had a very different experience of family life and of my parents during those summers in India.
When you were back at home in England, what was clear to you about what was expected of you academically? How important was school success to your mum and dad?
It was everything. It was literally everything. I think this is very common in a lot of immigrant families. I guess, I should be more specific, certainly in Indian immigrant families to the UK. I don't know if it's the same in Australia, but I would imagine it is, that a huge priority is put on academic success. So to the point where I can still remember coming back from school, I must have been, 6 or 7 years old, coming back from school, really excited to see mum and dad and tell them that I got 19 out of 20 in the test today. And I can still remember mum and or dad, they wouldn't say well done. The first question was, what did you get wrong? The second question would have been, were you top of the class? Oh, no. Okay, who got the top mark? Okay, how many points away from them were you? And I've gone through a process on that, Sarah, because actually that kind of thing is very impactful to a child. So the way I look at it now is that I think that little Rangan got the idea very early on that I was only loved when I was top dog, when I was top of the class or I got full marks. Okay. And I can see very clearly how that has affected me negatively for much of my life. To the point where I would say until about, 4 or 5 years ago, I don't think I was really happy. From the outside, things would have looked great. I'm a medical doctor. I've done my specialist qualifications, my general practice qualifications. I have an immunology degree. I have my own series on BBC One, the main channel in the UK. I have a hit podcast. I have Sunday Times bestsellers. These things all look fantastic from the outside. But I honestly don't think until a few years ago I was truly content. And I think some of that came from my childhood experience and the pressure that was put on me to, be academically very, very successful. Now, when you start to process your childhood, initially you can fall into the trap of blame and go, God, why did mum and dad do that? And actually, when I wrote, not my latest book, but 2 books back on my book on happiness, I remember as I was writing it, I was writing about this story and I went around to see my mum and said, hey, mum, why was it that when I was a child, you were so hard on me about exam results? And she just said, oh, because I just knew how capable you were. So I just wanted to make sure you were, realizing your full potential. And that was a very important conversation for me because I realized that every story has multiple perspectives, right? So I can say, yeah, and you can gasp, Sarah, when you hear me recount the story of mum saying, well, not well done, you got 19 out of 20. What did you get wrong? But I realized that there's no one truth to anything, right? Every situation in life has multiple perspectives. I can now see it from mum and dad's perspective. Mum and dad came to the UK in the 60s and the 70s. There was discrimination at the time. It was difficult to advance in certain professions. My dad certainly had to even change specialities because of discrimination. From their perspective, I get it. They came to the UK. They want a better life for their children. And from their perspective, the way to get a better life is to be a straight A student, get into medical school, and then you're going to have no problems. So to them, it totally makes sense. So me as a dad myself now, I'm like, oh, I get it. I fully understand why mum and dad pushed me so hard. At the same time, I think it also had a negative impact on me. Both of those things can be true.
So as you say, from their perspective, it made sense to have these high expectations of you and focus you academically and assume that you're going to go on and study medicine. Was there any part of you back then that kicked against that, Rangan? Was there any child or teenage rebel that wanted something
big time.
else?
Okay, so it may surprise you, but when I was like 16, 17, and even into my early 20s, I had long black hair, mid-back, ponytail at uni. I played in rock bands for years. Was a singer, guitar player. I, wear cowboy boots and bandanas at uni.
Was there a parallel life that you were living, at least in your imagination, about what your future might look like?
Yeah, I think when I was 16, 17, part of me wanted to be a musician and a songwriter. And I spent all my spare time playing my guitar, writing songs, going to gigs. I had a band all throughout uni. In my 20s, I had a band where we'd go and play in Chamonix in France every winter and do après-ski shows. And I remember, actually, it's kind of folklore within my family that the medical degree in the UK is 5 years. Okay, and so after 2 years at medical school, if you want to, you can take a year out of your medical school course and do what's called an intercalated degree in a scientific subject, and I chose immunology. So I took a year out and I was doing my year of immunology. And in that year, so I must have been, 20, something like that. It was the Christmas holidays and I was back home. And I think I don't know when I said it, I think it was a few days before Christmas. I think I said to mum and dad, guys, I think I'm going to finish my immunology degree this year, and then I'm quitting. I'm going to hit the road with my band.
How did that go down?
Well, it's kind of interesting. I don't think my dad would talk to me. So I don't think for a few days, and my mum was trying to keep the peace between me and dad, and my mum would sit me down and go, listen, I know you love your music, but why don't you finish your medical degree first? Okay, because then you've got options in the future. She was trying to, basically give me good advice from a parenting perspective. And here's the truth, Sarah. I'm not sure I really meant it. Your question was, did any part of you rebel? And I think that was me at the age of 20 trying to push the boundaries, go, there's something. Again, I'm not having a go at anyone. I'm not criticizing anyone. But I think that was the part of me inside that was just pushing back a little bit as to what am I doing? Now, as it happens, I think medicine is the perfect career for me. I think I've found my true calling over the last 10 years or so. That what I do with my books, with these live shows, with my podcast, sharing information for people in a hopefully simplified and practical way for them to improve their lives is something that I think I've got a skill at, and it's something that I really, really enjoy. I actually think all my years as a musician and playing in front of audiences has really helped me.
You did not disappoint mum and dad and continued with your medical studies. Of course, in another incredibly competitive and stressful environment, medical school. You've talked about some of the less healthy ways you handled that stress when you were a medical student. What did that include?
Well, look, I went to Edinburgh Medical School, which was 240 miles away from where I grew up. And so, my parents were great growing up, okay? No question about it. But, you're 18 years old, you go to a new city, you're making new friends, and, there's a strong partying culture at medical school. There certainly was back then. And so, if you turn up at medical school and you don't drink alcohol, by the end of Freshers Week, 7 days later, you will be drinking alcohol, right? It was like, it's almost expected. And I remember the first week was quite a baptism of fire for me. But you end up drinking quite a lot. You're out with your friends all the time, in the week, Friday nights, Saturday nights. It's a big part of what you do. And again, I don't have a problem with anyone drinking, just to be clear, right? In the sense that I think everyone's entitled to make the decisions that they want to make for their life. I just want to make sure people understand the consequences of those decisions. And, as it happens, I'm 47 at the moment, and I don't think I've drunk any alcohol for about 5 years now, 5.5 years now. And again, I have no issue with people wanting to drink. For me, as part of this process of trying to get in tune with who I am and what I want, I realized that who I am today, drinking alcohol just it's not what I want to be doing at the moment. Okay. It's just not like, I love waking up at 5 a.m, feeling fresh and clear headed. I love it. Ever since I had children who would get up early, I've always tried to get up before them so I have a bit of time to myself each morning. And so it's all about that living an intentional life. And I realized that I kind of started drinking at university in order to fit in and, make friends and do what everyone else is doing. I think many of us end up in that trap, and we never ask ourselves, why are we even engaging in this behavior in the first place? And I'm not saying I'll never drink alcohol again. I might do at some point, right? I may do, I may not. At this moment in my life, I'm quite happy not drinking.
You got through medical school, and around that time, that's when your dad's health took a real turn for the worse. How involved were you in his day-to-day care after he was diagnosed with lupus?
It was 97, 98 when I was basically in this apartment in Edinburgh that we were renting, me and some mates. And one night I got a call, and I think one of my flatmates picked it up and said, "Oh, Rangan, it's your mum." So I was like, "Oh, hi, mum." And she's like, "Hey, listen, son, Dad's in hospital. He's in intensive care, and the doctors are saying he may not last the night. You need to come home now." I was like, "Well, hold on." I knew Dad was being investigated. He had this fever for a few months. No one quite knew what was causing it. But things suddenly got really, really bad. And I remember putting the phone down. And this is pre-internet, right? This is pre the way that we live today. And so I was phoning around a few places, bus stations. I couldn't find a way of getting back home. And so my flatmate, Steve, said, "Mate, listen, I'm going to drive you." And I always remember this. Steve, he's still one of my best mates today. And we left probably about 11 p.m., 11:30. It was a 4-hour drive. He drove me through the night back home to the hospital so I could see my dad. And he left me there and he drove back, all the way back up to Edinburgh. And that was, Dad had basically, his kidneys had suddenly failed. He was in crashing. He had basically loads of fluid in his lungs, so he couldn't breathe. He did end up surviving, but his kidneys completely, got damaged from the whole experience. He had kidney failure, and from then he needed dialysis. Now, I don't remember all the ins and outs of what happened back then, but there's no way in hell my dad would have accepted me coming back home to help look after him, because remember, his whole thing was about giving me and my brother the best education that he could. And now his son's at this prestigious medical school in Edinburgh. If I was to stop doing that to come back and look after him, that would have almost been like the opposite of what he would have ever wanted, right? So I did end up going back to Edinburgh. I'd come home regularly. So initially it was more mum and my brother, my older brother, who were doing the day-to-day care. And I finished my medical studies up in Edinburgh. But a couple of years after qualifying and working, I decided to move back to the northwest of England. Dad's health was deteriorating, and I wanted to come back and help look after him.
Did you start seeing him in a new light then, Rangan? That's such a reversal of that relationship, this very powerful, supportive, loving, but I guess high expectations father, and then he's needing your care. How did that shift your relationship?
Yeah, relating to what you asked me before, Sarah, about seeing my dad, the kind of real weird irony is that I saw my dad so much more when he became sick, because he had to medically retire. So he retired earlier than he had planned. So I think he had to retire at the age of 58 or 59. And that certainly was not in the game plan. In terms of even my dad's financial planning was all based around him working until 65, like as most doctors would do. So I think it really did change my relationship with Dad, because I'd see him a lot more and I talked to him a lot more. When I moved back to the northwest of England, I initially moved in with Mum and Dad, so I actually lived back at home again. It was probably quite hard for me, without realizing it at the time, to see my dad needing help, because dad was someone who never, ever took a sick day. Like, ever. Just, if he was ill or it doesn't matter, you go to work, right? It just wasn't even an option for him. I wasn't thinking about those things at the time. I was in my 20s. But looking back now, that must have been quite tricky for me to actually see this all-powerful father who could only sleep 3 nights a week, who even in our summer holidays, so the summer holidays where we didn't go to India, what we did was we'd go around Europe. We'd go on these driving holidays. My dad would literally drive all summer. So I remember one night, I think we drove from Italy all the way back to the north of France so we can get the ferry back to the UK. I think it was like a 14-hour drive, and my dad did that himself through the night. Given how hard he worked, you would think that in his summer holidays, he'd want to just sleep 7 nights a week and actually recover. But one of the things that happened in his final couple of years of being alive, I'd start to hear things from my dad that he never shared before. And one of the things he shared with me was the discrimination he faced. Now, my dad never, ever complained about anything. He never, ever complained about discrimination. Literally, probably in the months before he died, he shared to me what happened. So my dad used to be in obstetrics and gynecology. And he said that the reason he changed to a different speciality, which he didn't actually enjoy and didn't want to be in, was because he realized after a few years that he was what's called a senior registrar, so the rank just below consultant. And he said, I realized after years that I kept training up all the junior doctors, and after you'd see all of them would just jump me and become consultant. Everyone who I would train, after a few years, they would jump him and become consultant. And he said, I soon realized that I was never, ever going to get a consultant post in that speciality. And so the easiest one that he could transition to from obs and gynae was what's called GU medicine, genitourinary medicine. And so I have a greater appreciation now. I go, wow, this generation, me, and what I say to my kids is about doing a job that you love and doing the things that, set your heart on fire. And I'm thinking, my dad never did any of that, right? He took a job, he changed speciality so that he could get a consultant post, which would mean stability. And that's why he moved to Manchester, because that's where he got his consultant post. Now, I didn't realize that at the time. But now, as someone who is a father, I'm like, wow, I do a job, Sarah, that I absolutely love. And I think, oh, wow, my dad chose a speciality that he really did not enjoy for the benefit of his family. And the fact that he shared that this discrimination story only in the months before his death it was a real lesson for me that he didn't complain. He just got on with things. And it was only after my dad's death, actually, when at dad's funeral, when I actually met some of his old colleagues and old friends, and they said to me, your dad was one of the best surgeons we ever came across. He was so good. He was so meticulous. I'm like, oh my God, I didn't know this side of my dad. I didn't even know that he was that good. He never boasted to me about how good he was. He never told me that that's what he really, really enjoyed. But my dad traded all that in. So in GU medicine, in genitourinary medicine, you're not a surgeon. He didn't do any surgery. It was just clinical work. He was just doing these long clinics, basically. And I'm like, wow. It was amazing to hear these things after dad died, that he was a brilliant surgeon. So again, these are things that if my dad was alive, I'd love to talk to dad about. And, what did you enjoy about surgery, dad? What was it like for you when you had to actually realize you were never going to operate again, but you chose a job you didn't like for the betterment of your family?
In the years after the death of your dad, Rangan, you got married and welcomed the first of your 2 children. But while you and your wife were on holiday in France, your baby son became very unwell suddenly. What happened?
My son was 6 months old, my wife and I's first child. And I remember it was just after Christmas. We were going to a place called Chamonix in France to stay in a friend's apartment. And they were going to come out and see us. And we were going to, just hang out in the mountains, maybe do a bit of skiing, but we didn't know. And we got there. We were in this chalet basically by ourselves first night. And my wife, for whatever reason, didn't put my son to bed at the normal time in the bedroom. He was a bit snotty and sniffly through the day, but for whatever reason, she didn't want to put him down. And so she was sitting with him in the living room, and it was this open plan kitchen and living room, and I was just washing up in the kitchen. And then suddenly she shouted out to me saying, "Rangan, come now, he's not moving." And my son had just basically, he'd basically just gone stiff and his arms had gone back and he wasn't responding. And I was in total shock. She was in shock. I didn't know what was happening. My initial thought was maybe he's choking on some of the phlegm because he's been really snotty all day. So I turned him over, put him on my hands with his chest on my hand, and I was trying to clear his airway by hitting on his back, and nothing was happening. And I think, if I'm completely honest, that I froze. I was just like, what is going on? And my wife said, "Rangan, quick, we just said, get in the car, let's get to the hospital." So we quickly ran out of the chalet into the hire car. I nearly killed us all driving to the hospital because it was down a hill to get onto the main road. It had just snowed, and I skidded the car because I was just trying to get him into the hospital. And thankfully, the hospital was only 2 minutes down the road. We ended up getting there, and you could see when the doctors were examining him, they were really worried because convulsions are not uncommon in children or babies, what's called a febrile convulsion. So if the child has a fever, that's often a reason why they convulse. And that's not really deemed dangerous. It's like, bring the fever down and the convulsion will stop. But my son didn't have a fever. So you could see that they were worried. Why is this 6-month-old baby not moving? Why is he in this state?
And what could they tell you? What had happened?
Nothing initially. They weren't saying much. In fact, they said, "Can you just help us by holding your son's head?" So I had to hold my son's head to the side so they could put a line into his neck. And it was just crazy. And then after about 10, 15 minutes, they said, "We're going to have to get him down to the main hospital down the valley." So he went into an ambulance with my wife, and I tried to follow or came afterwards in the hire car. And so we were then in this big hospital, and it was hours before we found out what was happening. And it ended up being that he had what's called a hypocalcemic convulsion. So he had very low levels of calcium in his blood, and that was secondary to a vitamin D deficiency. So in essence, he had low levels of vitamin D, and that caused low levels of calcium, and that's what caused him to suddenly have that convulsion. Now, here's the thing. Modern medicine was great in that emergency situation. He got intravenous calcium, and he got a vitamin D injection, right? But then the day after or 2 days later, we were being discharged. And I was thinking, yeah, but is that it? What about the fact that he may have been vitamin D deficient for the first 4, 5, 6 months of his life? And nothing. It was just like, oh, just go now and, here, just take vitamin D. And I was reading up about vitamin D. I had been anyway for a few months and thinking, well, vitamin D is critical for your immune system. Could this be why he's got eczema? Could this be why he's got a cow's milk allergy? And I became obsessed, Sarah. So we left the hospital in France after this had happened, and I felt really, really bad. I felt really, really guilty because I have had perfectionist tendencies for much of my life. And I couldn't get my head around the fact that I was this, super qualified doctor from a great medical school, having done my specialist exams, all this sort of stuff, yet I wasn't able to prevent my son from nearly dying from a preventable vitamin deficiency. So on a personal level, I remember coming out of the hospital that day with my son, and I made a vow to myself that I was going to get him back to full health as if this had never happened. And I became obsessed. I would spend hours a day online researching, vitamin D, the gut microbiome, the immune system. I was just reading, thinking, what can I do? What can I do? Can I repair some of the damage that may have taken place over the last few months? I would go around the world to conferences. I would learn so many new things. And what was really interesting, Sarah, is that a lot of things I was learning, I didn't get taught about at medical school. So I was learning about vitamin D, the immune system, gut health, the gut microbiome, the importance of lifestyle, all these things I was learning about, thinking, I don't know anything about this. Medical school didn't teach me any of this stuff. And to cut a long story short, all the things I learned, I started to implement with my son and getting a great improvement with him. The same things we start to implement as a family, we're all feeling better. The same principles I started to implement with my patients at the time, and I was realizing, wow, I'm getting my patients much better than I ever have them before, and I'm using less and less medication. And again, that whole experience, a bit like my dad's death, actually. I now see my son's illness when he was 6 months old as another gift, right? Now, let me be really clear what I mean by that. Do I wish he hadn't been sick? Yes, of course I do. But living with guilt and regret, I learned very soon after as a dad, that's not what my son needs from me. He doesn't need a guilty dad who's feeling bad about what happened and is trying to overcompensate. That's not what he needs. He needs a dad who processes this stuff and comes to terms with it, right? That's me putting my baggage onto him. So I don't feel guilty anymore. Again, I've reframed that experience as like I've reframed my dad's death as being a gift. You could argue that had my son never become unwell, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing today.
When you say you wanted to really implement changes in your son's life and then your family's life and then with your patients in the GP clinic, what do you boil those down to? What changes did you want to make on that micro level, really, that you saw having such an impact?
It really comes down to our lifestyle. He had a vitamin D deficiency. So yes, we correct the vitamin D deficiency with supplementation. But of course, you also get, the main source of vitamin D for humans is from the sunlight on our skin for a short period of time, where the sunlight actually interacts with the skin. And that's what makes the vast majority of the vitamin D in our body. But when you start studying vitamin D, that very quickly leads you onto the immune system, because vitamin D, although it's called a vitamin, actually works in the body like a hormone and has a profound impact on your bones, your brain, all kinds of different systems in the body, but hugely on your immune system. And the more you study that realm, you're naturally led to lifestyle, right? And what I call the 4 pillars of health: food, movement, sleep, and relaxation. And when you learn the science of lifestyle and the physiological changes that happen in your body, when you pay attention to those 4 areas, you very quickly realize that 80 to 90% of what we see as doctors in the 21st century is in some way related to our collective modern lifestyles. Now, this is not about putting blame on people, right? People are trying to do their best. People are having to work in jobs that are indoors, that are sedentary, where they can't move as much as they might want to, or eat the healthy foods that they want to, or they've got too much stress in their life in order to be able to sleep appropriately, or whatever it might be. But nonetheless, we have to acknowledge, and I don't think within my profession there is a deep understanding of this yet. I think this is changing. But when you say lifestyle, Sarah, most people think, yeah, I get it. Obesity, type 2 diabetes, that's related to lifestyle. Yeah, of course. But it's not just that. Anxiety, depression, migraines, gut problems, brain fog, concentration, energy, all kinds of things that come in to us today as doctors. These issues are related to our lifestyle. And what we get taught in medical school is how to diagnose disease and give a treatment. And that treatment is usually a pharmaceutical medication. Now, that has value for sure, some of the time, not all of the time. I got to showcase these principles, Sarah, in 2015 for the first time in a very big way on the BBC One series, Doctor in the House, where I went into families' houses who had been sick for years, who were all under doctors already and on medication. And I was able to show with each family, within 4 to 6 weeks, you could either fully reverse their condition or make it significantly better by addressing these 4 areas of your lifestyle: food, movement, sleep, and relaxation. I helped a lady reduce her panic attacks by 70% in just 6 weeks by addressing her lifestyle. A lady with hormonal symptoms who her doctor wanted to put her on hormones, HRT, she was in her late 40s and she didn't want to go on them. I pretty much helped her eliminate all of her symptoms by addressing her lifestyle in 6 weeks. IBS, the same thing. The list goes on. And so the reason I'm sharing all these things is because although my son was only a baby and it was to do with vitamin D, once you start opening your eyes and you study vitamin D, it leads you to the immune system, which leads you to the gut microbiome, which leads you to the various aspects of your lifestyle. And then you realize, wow, I've been trained in a disease-focused model. That's what modern Western medicine does, and it's very good at that. But in a world now where 80 to 90% of what we see is actually driven by the way we're living our lives, we have to broaden our approach. We have to go, wait a minute, maybe I don't need to medicate this person in front of me. Maybe I need to, talk to them about their lifestyle and see if they're interested in making changes to their lifestyle.
How do you approach building happiness into your life and understanding the differences between it and those ideas of success that you were raised with?
What does it mean to actually be happy? I think about 2 different types of happiness. Junk happiness are those habits that we engage in that make us feel good, like scrolling social media for a bit, having a chocolate bar, having an alcoholic drink, buying a new pair of shoes, whatever it might be. Those things, there's nothing inherently wrong with them. The problem comes when we engage in them too often, or we mistake them for giving us the deep levels of happiness that I think all humans really are seeking. So I contrast junk happiness with what I call core happiness, which is what I think all humans really do want. And there are 3 ingredients to core happiness: alignment, contentment, and control. So alignment is when your inner values and your external actions start to match up more and more. Basically, when the person you really are inside and the person who you are being out there in the world are one and the same. Contentment is about the things that you can do in your life that give you that sense of peace, calm, and contentment. And control is about a sense of control. And arguably, it's something that's never been more important, because these days, many people feel as though their lives are out of control, or the world around them is out of control. You turn on the news and you see the negativity and what's going on around the world. People can often feel really down and powerless. And that's why doing things regularly that give you a sense of control is really, really important. So happiness has these 3 ingredients: alignment, contentment, and control. And the case I make is that you don't work on your happiness directly. You work on simple things that help you with your alignment, with your contentment, and with your sense of control, and you will find that you are happier more often. So what does that mean? Okay, how do you actually do that? Well, one of my favorite exercises that I share with people all the time, but I also do regularly myself, is what I call the Write Your Own Happy Ending exercise. And it's super simple, and it goes like this. The first part is you imagine you're on your deathbed. And now, looking back on your life, what are 3 things you will want to have done or spent time doing? Now, all of us are different, right? So we all may say slightly different things, but we're not as different as you might imagine, because palliative care nurses tell us that people on their deathbed tend to all say the same things. In fact, the Australian Bronnie Ware wrote the beautiful book, The 5 Regrets of the Dying. And she was a palliative care nurse for 7 or 8 years. And she said, Rangan, on their deathbed, people say the same things. I wish I'd worked less. I wish I spent more time with my friends and family. I wish I'd allowed myself to be happy. I wish I'd lived my life and not the life that other people expected of me. Right? These are the things that everyone tends to say. So let's go back to this exercise, okay? You're on your deathbed. Looking back on your life, what are 3 things you'll want to have done? So for me, the last time I did that exercise, I wrote down these 3 things. I will want to have spent quality time with my friends and family. Number 2, I will want to have done something that helps improve the lives of other people. And thirdly, I will want to have had time to engage and pursue my own passions. The second part is when you come right back into the present. And right back in the present, you write down now 3 weekly happiness habits that you could do that would guarantee you get the happy ending you just defined that you wanted. Okay? So for me, the last time I did it, I wrote down, okay, number 1, have at least 5 meals a week with my wife and my children where I'm fully present and not distracted by work. Okay, that's an arbitrary number, but it's a number that I chose. Because if I do that week after week, I know that I'm spending quality time with my family, which is one of the things that I specified that I want. The second one is, if I record and release a podcast every week, as I have been doing for 7.5 years now, I know that each week I'm doing something that is improving the lives of other people. And the third thing on my list of weekly happiness habits is, if I get some time each week to either play my guitar, write a song, or go for a long run in nature, then I know I've carved out a bit of time for me to pursue my passions. And I literally have that on a piece of paper that's stuck to my fridge in my kitchen with blue tack. It's nothing fancy, but it means every day I'm walking past it, I'm being visually reminded of what is truly important in my life. Now, I'm not perfect, Sarah. Okay, it doesn't mean I do it every week. But if, for example, I'm traveling with work and I don't have any meals with my wife and kids that week, it's just a nice reminder when I get back, okay, let's make sure that doesn't become a new habit. Let's just make sure, okay, that was last week. How can I start to redress the balance? And I have used that exercise with so many patients, and it is such a simple but impactful exercise because it reminds us of what is truly important. So you asked me, how do I make sure that I'm living that happy and contented life? Well, it's by doing that exercise. It's by making sure that those 3 things get done, if not every week, certainly with regularity. Because people live now, Sarah, in a world where our to-do lists are never done. If I think I'm only going to fit those important things in once my work is done, they ain't going to happen. And this is the trap that so many people fall into. I'll fit that in when I've got time. I'm like, no. You're never going to have time. You got to make time for those things day to day, week to week. Your work will still get done. And arguably, if there are elements of your work that don't get done, and this obviously depends on who you are and what kind of autonomy you have, well, maybe that's okay.
Well, Rangan, you've given us a lot to think about, and I really appreciate you making time in your trip to Australia to talk to Conversations. Thank you so much for being my guest.
Thanks for having me, Sarah.
Rangan Chatterjee is a physician, author and podcast host currently on tour in Australia. His latest book is called Make Change That Lasts. This episode of Conversations was produced by Meggie Morris. Our executive producer is Nicola Harrison. I'm Sarah Kanowski. Thanks for listening.
ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.